Hello, I'm Katie Geyer, like Brandon said before, and today I'll be doing a little talk with you guys about crime and the criminal justice system in general as it pertains to inequality. So, I first wanted to just ask you guys, what do you think of when I say the word criminal? Like, do you have a certain person in mind? Does a certain neighborhood come in mind? Any ideas? No wrong answers here, so just shout out whatever you think is. Anybody?
Male.
Male, okay. Do you see them as, yes? Yes? Someone who's broken the law, sure.
I think that, I don't know if you can specifically explain on that,
Right, yeah. You're kind of getting at my later point, jumping ahead there. But do you think of wealthy people when you think of criminals? Do you think of poor people? Both kinds? Okay. So my general point here is that we have kind of a perceived idea of what criminals are, who criminals are, but in reality, we're all kind of criminals. So has anyone here ever participated? Has anyone ever sped in their life while they're going down the highway? You're going like 10 over. That's a crime. So technically, you guys are criminals, and technically we all are criminals. And this pertains to things like underage drinking too, which I'm not going to ask you who all has participated in underage drinking, because I don't think that's information I want to know. But it pertains to small things like speeding and underage drinking, but it also pertains to more things like substance abuse or even marijuana use. And I have this little video that I'm going to play a clip of that kind of sums up everything that we're going to talk about today. And basically my point is that while we're all criminals in some capacity, some people are disproportionately affected by the system that we use to punish criminals. So.
So bored. Winning is getting old.
Over the last few weeks, you've heard me say many times that deviance isn't necessarily criminal. But of course, sometimes it is. Sociologists have crimes was. So what can we say about who's committing these crimes? Well, based on government data, sociologists have put together a kind of demographic picture, but it only shows us who's being arrested for crime, not necessarily who's committing it. To begin with, the average arrestee is young and male. People between the ages of 15 and 24 make up about 14% of the population, but accounted for 31.8% of all arrests in 2015. And while men are about half the population, they made up about 62% of arrests for property crimes and 80% of arrests for violent crimes. And while FBI data don't assess social class, we know from other sources that those of lower social class are more likely to be arrested. But again, that's not the whole picture, because as we talked about last time, wealthy Americans aren't likely to be seen as criminally deviant in the same way that the poor are. This brings us to race and ethnicity, where disparities in arrests are clear. Despite making up only 13.3% of the population, African Americans make up 26.6% of arrests. There are a number of reasons for this. First, race and ethnicity are closely linked to wealth and social standing, and as we just saw, people of lower social class are more likely to be arrested. Second, the data don't include many crimes that are more commonly committed by whites, like drunk driving, embezzlement, and tax fraud. Finally, African Americans and people of color generally are over-criminalized. They're more easily assumed to be criminal and treated as such by both the police and the public at large. For example, a study of pedestrian stops in New York City found that African Americans and Hispanics are disproportionately likely to be stopped, even when controlling for race-specific arrest rates. That is, the rate at which those racial and ethnic groups are arrested. And this rate itself isn't entirely fair. Despite the fact that Black people and white people use drugs at similar rates, Black people are far more likely to be arrested for it. A 2009 Human Rights Watch report found that in 2007, Black people were 3.7 times more likely to be arrested for drugs than white people. And studies have shown that the racial composition of a neighborhood has an influence on perceptions of crime in that neighborhood. Larger African American populations, for example, have been found to be associated with increased perception of crime, even when controlling for the actual crime rate. And this brings us to our third question: how society responds to crime. Overcriminalization, after all, isn't a matter of who commits crimes, but of how society imagines who criminals are. Society's main institutional response to crime comes from the criminal justice system, which is composed of three parts in the U.S. the police, the courts, and the system of punishment and correction. The police are the main point of contact between the criminal justice system and the rest of society. There are about 750,000 police officers in the United States, and it's their personal judgment that makes for the actual application of the law. And in exercising this judgment, police officers size up a situation according to a number of factors. The severity of the situation, the suspect's level of uncooperativeness, and whether the suspect has previously been arrested, all make an arrest more likely. Officers also take the wishes of the victim into account. Likewise, the presence of observers makes an arrest more likely, because making an arrest moves the encounter to the police station where the officer is in control. Finally, the suspect's race plays a role, as officers are more likely to arrest non-white suspects because of a long-standing association of non-whiteness with criminality, which is the cultural basis for overcriminalization. And the effects of this can be clearly seen not only in the data on overcriminalization that I mentioned before, but in studies of race and perceptions of threat. And race shouldn't be understood as an independent factor here. The other factors are all seen through race. So when a police officer assesses how threatening or uncooperative a suspect is, non-white suspects are viewed as more threatening and more uncooperative, even given the same behavior. The point here is that policing has a lot of aspects to it that are surprisingly subjective. Given this problem, we might expect the courts to help correct them by accurately adjudicating guilt and innocence, and sometimes they do. But in practice, how well they do their job is often a matter of who the defendant is and the economic resources that they have access to. Let's go to the thought bubble to see how people with less money are affected differently by the criminal justice system. The first problem is bail. Bail allows people to be released from jail after an arrest by guaranteeing, usually with a deposited sum of money, that they'll show up for their day in court. But in practice, it just keeps defendants without money behind bars until their court date, a date which may be a long time coming. The Sixth Amendment guarantees the right to a speedy trial, but many jurisdictions in the US are heavily overburdened. There are just too many cases. So those who can't afford bail may wait months, even years, before their case is heard. And defendants who can't afford to hire lawyers are represented by public defenders, who are, to varying degrees, underpaid and overworked. They often simply can't give their clients adequate representation, frequently leading to harsher sentences for the poor. Together, these make the last issue, plea bargaining, much worse. Plea bargaining is basically a negotiation in which the prosecution offers concessions on the legal punishment in exchange for the defendant's guilty plea. In theory, this is a useful tool for quickly resolving simple cases and easing the burden on the courts. But while plea bargaining may be a negotiation, the parties aren't on even footing. A poor defendant stuck in jail because they can't make bail, represented by a public defender without the resources to adequately defend them, and facing the threat of a long jail sentence, is strongly incentivized to take a plea bargain, regardless of their actual guilt or innocence. Thanks, Thought Bubble.
Alright, so this video has a lot of great information on it about what we're mainly talking about today. If you're interested in watching the full video, it's just like a crash course in crime and inequality on YouTube. But the main point of that is that some people are disproportionately affected by the criminal justice system when it doesn't necessarily represent their place in the population. And that certain forces are stacked against people when they enter the criminal justice system, and it happens at different levels. So you have racial inequality, gender inequality, and wealth inequality that we'll kind of go through now. So the first one is racial inequality. So African Americans and people of color are incarcerated at a higher rate than whites. So it's not, there are technically more white people that are in the prison system, but it's about their representation, the prison system compared to their overall population in the outside world. So like she said in the video, African Americans take up like 13.6% of the overall United States population, but they represent a higher amount of the prison population. And the same thing with people of color in general. And yeah, so African Americans, people of color are disproportionately affected in the criminal justice system and prison population, and they're often likely to get longer sentences for the same crimes. So there's an example, I forget his name, but compared to Brock Turner, there was an African American male who was convicted of rape, but was sentenced for a longer time when Brock Turner was convicted of the same crime that he was. So his race kind of played a factor in him getting a longer sentence. And then there's the lines of gender. So men are disproportionately affected by the criminal justice system. Like you said before, when you think of the word criminal, you think of male, because they do make up 80%, like she said in the video, of the people in the criminal justice system. However, women are the fastest growing inmate population. So in prison and jails, women have doubled the rate of growth as men in the both populations have been growing, but the women population growth has been twice as much as the male population growth. And this is just a little comic that shows how incarceration can be open to black young males because that fits every criteria. So like she talked about in the video, young people are more likely to be in prison, African Americans are more likely to be in prison, and males are more likely to be in prison. So you add all those three together and you get this kind of intersectionality of things that could go wrong. And it's not necessarily that great of a system. But another way, another section of this is class. So the lower socioeconomic status you are in, the less resources you have. So like she said in the video, you don't have money to pay for bail. So you don't have the resources to be out and to be campaigning on your behalf while you're awaiting your trial. Because trials can take years to even like be conceptualized. So you might have pre-trials, a trial, until you actually get to where you want to be. Most people in lower socioeconomic status are in prison from that time, like all that time, even if they're considered innocent. And then, like she said, there was, in the video, there's a problem of attorneys. So public defenders are often overworked, and they get paid little to no money for their services because we're all entitled to an attorney of law, even if we can't pay for it. So if you have lower socioeconomic status, you don't have the money to shell out for great lawyers that can spend like days or hours on your behalf. And then sometimes being poor can result in longer sentences. Like she was talking about in the video, plea bargains. So plea bargains constitute like 90% of what happens in our criminal justice system. Because if every case went to trial, our system would collapse. So 90% of all cases end in plea bargains, and usually it's because people don't have the money and they don't have the means to go on to stake their innocence or get a lower sentence in trial. And another aspect of this is white-collar crime. So, has anybody in here seen The Office? Yeah. So do you remember when the Stanford and the Scranton branches combined and they found out that they had one guy that had a criminal record and had been to prison? And he talked about prison. He said, oh, it's a great place. I had all these college classes. I got all this rec time and everything like that. And people were starting to say, well, maybe prison is better than our office life. But he was committed for a white-collar crime, which includes things like tax evasion, fraud, and money laundering. And they often get, people that commit white-collar crimes often get treated differently than people that commit, like, regular crimes. So, like, the traditional, like, drug possession or the 7 index crimes, like rape, murder, larceny, things like that. And they often get put into, because they often have more money, people that commit white-collar crimes. They have more money to be able to do things like fraud and money laundering, so they get treated better in the criminal justice system. An example of this is Martha Stewart. Like, she got arrested and she got sent to like a cupcake camp or something like that for her sentence. But if she were poor, she would probably be sent to jail. And these crimes are mostly committed by white people that have a higher socioeconomic status, because other people don't have the means to commit tax fraud, because who can even commit tax fraud? I don't know. I've never committed that. I don't know. But this is the funny comic. She says, I am innocent. I've just never been able to pass up a good plea bargain. So it's this whole idea that some people take plea bargains just so that they don't have to deal with a speedy trial, or because their attorney says to them, oh, well, you're probably looking at 10 years if you go to trial, but right now we can give you 2 years and you can get out at that time. And comparatively in that situation, you're like, well, do I want 10 years or do I want 2? And to some people, it's just a no-brainer. And like she said in the video, the criminal justice system is composed of 3 parts. And inequality happens at all 3 of those parts. So one of the parts was the correction and the prison system. So there's this whole idea that African Americans and people of color are disproportionately affected and disproportionately incarcerated. And there's a people of color are more likely to spend time in solitary confinement as well. So it's not even that they're being incarcerated at higher rates, they're also spending more time in isolation. Also, African Americans are 5 times more likely, she said in the video 3.7 times more likely, but I think that was for drug crimes, but they're 5 times more likely to be incarcerated than whites for the same crimes. And when white people actually commit the crimes at higher rates, but African Americans are actually arrested more. And then poor whites are often misrepresented in the criminal justice system because of the large influx of drug crimes. So it's a huge area, it's a huge issue in this area of Appalachia. So you have a lot of poor whites that are committing drug crimes and then getting arrested. And then inequality also happens with the police, like she was kind of talking about in the video. So you have African American and people of color being having disproportional interactions with the police. So people of color are more likely to be stopped and frisked, and they're more likely to be stopped at traffic stops in general, like she was talking about in the video, the New York statistics. And police officers are more likely to patrol in neighborhoods where they know that people of color live, or they're more likely to patrol in neighborhoods where poor people live. And this makes calling the police for some people frowned upon or dangerous. So if you bring the people into your community that are sort of doing bad things to other community members, like arresting them, sitting them in prison, then you're seen as a danger to the community, or you could be like discounted by the community. And like I said, there's more patrolling in poor neighborhoods as well. And then the court system also discriminates and has a system of inequality. Like I was talking about, they have longer sentences, and people are almost pressured into plea bargains when they don't have enough money to be able to pay for a lawyer. And I have this example that's in the news right now. So Robert Kraft is the Patriots owner, and he was recently arrested for a connection with a prostitution and human trafficking ring in Florida. And he was charged with 2 counts of solicitation of sex, and he didn't accept it. He had a plea bargain, but he didn't accept it, that he would be charged with just a misdemeanor and a $10,000 fine. Why do you guys think this is problematic? Do you have any ideas? If you were to accept this plea bargain, why do you think that this might come out differently for someone who is poor than the New England Patriots owner?
Well, he did accept the plea bargain, but the plea bargain was a $10,000 fine. So if someone of a lower class were to take the plea bargain, they still wouldn't be able to pay that fine probably.
Right, and what is $10,000 to the owner of the New England Patriots? It's like pocket change, right? Like that wouldn't affect him. He's claiming that he's completely innocent though, so he is not accepting the plea. But you can imagine different scenarios where this has happened, especially in the era of Me Too, where people just paid off the things that have gone wrong and they kind of just try to sweep it under the rug. So I have a little activity for you guys. I'd like you, if you have a phone or a laptop, I'd like you to take like 10 minutes, take like 5 minutes to try to find a case where you think supports this idea of inequality or you think discounts this idea of inequality. This could be, an example could be a rich person who got off on minimal charges like Robert Kraft, or it could be the wrongful shooting of some youth, or it could be a case where a person of color received a longer sentences than a white person in their position. If you want to pair up with a person next to you, you can go ahead. If you don't have a laptop or a computer or anything. And then after 5 minutes, we'll discuss the cases that you guys found and see why they might have some inequality presented in them and why some might not.
Oh yeah, I just heard
Jussie Smollett thing.
Okay.
I think it kind of discredits a lot of it because Michael Flynn was defending himself against the hoax following the Mueller report thing, and now he has to pay $5 million in legal fees. And Jussie Smollett, who had all this evidence showing he made this call, like a whole list, had all 16 indictments dropped, but also the court kept his $10,000 bail, which doesn't happen when you get charges dropped. So there's something.
Okay, so you think that that proves the whole inequality thing wrong, in a way?
I think it comes down to money more than anything.
Okay.
Or celebrities.
Yeah. So that kind of talks about the intersectionality, although Jesse, whatever his last name is, because I already forgot. Although he is a black male, he's also a celebrity, so he's rich. So he does have the money to be able to throw around to pay off some of his problems. I'm not discounting his experience as a black male, but him being rich does add some privilege to his existence in his life. Whereas somebody else in his position, like the other case you were talking about, might not do the same thing. Okay? That's a great example. Thanks. Anybody else? Yeah.
I have found like a random person, things like Robert, but he's super rich and he's like convicted of, not convicted, charged like for raping his 3-year-old daughter or whatever, but he paid like a lot of money for his lawyer, so he didn't get like any jail time.
Right. Right. Which that happens a lot. Sex crimes are often under sentence than they should be. I think the max in the United States for rape is like 3 years. So, but his money definitely played a huge role in him being able to pay off the lawyer so that he could be dismissed of the charges. Anybody else? Yeah.
I found about Michael Jackson that he had 14 counts of like child molestation, but eventually they were dropped, and it was found that he paid as much as $200 million to 20 families to keep him quiet.
Right. Yeah. And then that's the thing that we largely forgot about once he died and had his funeral and everything like that. So it's the money and it's also his fame that kind of counteracted what he actually did. So, thank you. Any other examples? Yeah.
Not a real example, but black man Richard Miles was sentenced to 40 years for murder and 20 years for attempted murder after being wrongfully convicted off of a single false identification of a witness. And the police department, the Dallas Police Department, had failed to disclose 2 other police reports identifying other suspects. And when they investigated them, and he was incarcerated for 15 years for 20 cases of premeditated murder,
Right. So wrongful incarceration is a huge area that mostly affects African Americans. And there's a whole complex history in the South. If you've ever heard of it, Brian Stevenson has a really good book called Just Mercy, where he is actually a lawyer that tries to combat wrongful incarcerations in Alabama. And he finds that most of the people on death row in Alabama are actually African Americans that are there for crimes that they didn't commit. And it's this whole kind of intertwined police department withholding evidence and things like that. And that's a great example. Thank you. Anybody else? Yeah?
I found one on the actor Woody Harrelson, and he was drunk after a nightclub, wanted out of a taxi, so he kicked the door open and broke it, and then ran away from cops, and then jumped into another taxi and continued to flee the cops. Nope. And he was only charged with disturbing the peace, and was only charged $390 in fine.
Yeah, could you imagine if a poor person were in that same position? They wouldn't even be able to pay the $390 fine. Or if it's an African American or a person of color, they might have gotten shot for evading arrest. So that's a great example. Anybody else? Yeah?
Is it like the Brock Turner one? Like he was only sentenced to like 6 months, but he only did 3, and they said it was like class privilege, and he was a white man and stuff.
Right, yeah. Whew. You guys are actually teaching me a lot of new things. I didn't know about some of these cases. But Brock Turner is a huge one. Like, white male, the judge even said that he had a lot of prospects so that he didn't want to ruin his life. So, Any other examples? Might be running a little short on time here, but if anybody else has anything they want to say? Any other examples for where inequality didn't happen? Yeah?
Tim Allen for smoking cocaine.
Mm-hmm. What, do you know anything about that? I've heard.
FAA, like, caught with some bricks, I think, that are in his bag. He was flying back from South America, and he went to jail for, like, maybe 1.5 to 2 years for it.
Okay. Well, it's been a pleasure teaching to you guys today. I hope you learned something new and that maybe you found some researching ability that you didn't have with the activity. Thank Brenna and for having me, and Dr. Vanderven for spying on me during this. But thank you guys so much.